In the untamed streets of Gold Rush San Francisco, where fortunes were made on dusty claims and lost in smoky saloons, one man dared to dream bigger than the gold in them hills. While cowboys carved trails and gunfighters made headlines, William Ralston was quietly building an empire that would transform the American frontier. They called him the King of California, but unlike the monarchs of old, his crown was forged in the fires of Western ambition. From a humble clerk to the master of the West's most powerful bank, Ralston's story isn't just about money. It's about how the Wild West grew up, and the price one man paid for reaching too far in a land where the sky was supposed to be the limit. Picture a San Francisco morning in 1853, when the fog rolled thick over muddy streets lined with canvas tents and wooden shacks. A young man steps off a steamship, his boots touching California soil for the first time. This wasn't William Ralston's first adventure. He'd already made a name for himself running steamboats on the Panama route. But as he gazed at the chaos of the busiest port in the West, he knew this would be his greatest gamble yet. The San Francisco that greeted Ralston was a city possessed by gold fever. The muddy waters of the bay churned with arriving ships, their holds packed with fortune seekers from every corner of the globe. The air rang with a dozen languages, from Chinese to Chilean Spanish, from Australian slang to Boston proper. The streets were a maze of possibility where a man might wake up penniless and go to bed a millionaire, or the other way around. In those days, banking wasn't done in marble halls. Most transactions happened in the back rooms of saloons, where dust-covered miners traded raw gold for paper money, and loan agreements were sealed with a handshake and a shot of whiskey. The few proper banks that existed were often just converted general stores, their safes guarded by men with loaded revolvers who sometimes had to use them. Ralston saw something different in this chaos. While others were digging in the Sierra foothills, he understood that real fortunes weren't in finding gold. They were in moving it. Every nugget pulled from the ground needed to be weighed, valued, stored, and converted into currency. Every miner needed supplies, every merchant needed credit, and every successful prospector needed somewhere safe to keep their newfound wealth. The streets Ralston walked were literally paved with gold, or at least gold dust. Shop owners would sweep their wooden sidewalks at the end of each day, saving the dust that fell from miners' clothes and pouches. Every handful of dirt in San Francisco seemed to glitter with possibility. But it wasn't just gold that filled the air, it was the electricity of transformation. This wasn't just a boomtown, it was the birth of a new era in the American West. In those early days, Ralston worked as a partner in a private banking house, learning the intricacies of frontier finance. He watched as men stumbled into banks with bags of gold dust, their hands shaking from weeks of hard labor, only to lose it all at the gambling tables by sundown. He saw shrewd merchants build empires from nothing more than well-timed loans and carefully cultivated relationships. Every day brought new lessons about human nature and the true meaning of value. The gold rush had unleashed more than just a scramble for precious metal. It had unleashed the raw energy of human ambition. Ships sat abandoned in the harbor, their crews long gone to the gold fields. Houses were built from the planks of these deserted vessels, and the city grew like a living thing, stretching its wooden limbs up the hills and out into the bay. Every morning brought new arrivals, every sunset saw fortunes made and lost. Ralston understood something that many missed. This wasn't chaos, it was opportunity waiting to be organized. While others saw disorder, he saw the foundations of an economic empire waiting to be built. The West didn't just need gold, it needed a system to manage that wealth, to turn the raw energy of the frontier into sustainable growth. In those first years, he built his reputation one transaction at a time. He wasn't just a banker, he was a confidant, an advisor, and sometimes even a friend to those who walked through his door. Miners might not have trusted banks, but they trusted men who could look them in the eye and speak plainly about both risks and rewards. Ralston cultivated these relationships carefully, knowing that in the West, a man's word was often worth more than any written contract. The city grew around him, and with each passing month, the raw edges of the frontier began to smooth. What had been tent cities became proper streets. Where once there were hastily built wooden shacks, substantial brick buildings began to rise. The change wasn't just physical, it was cultural. The Wild West was growing up, and Ralston was determined to help guide that transformation. But even as civilization took hold, dangers lurked. Fire was a constant threat in the wooden city, and more than once Ralston watched as entire blocks burned to the ground, only to be rebuilt higher and grander than before. Banking itself was a dangerous game. Without federal regulation, each bank printed its own currency, and not all paper money was created equal. A banker needed to be part financier, part detective, and part psychologist, able to spot a counterfeit bill or a fraudulent claim as easily as they could spot a genuine opportunity. Through it all, Ralston was learning, watching, and planning. He saw how the truly successful operators worked not in gold, but in information, knowing where the next strike would be, understanding which claims were worthy of investment, recognizing which men could be trusted with loans and which couldn't. He was building more than a business. He was building a vision of what the West could become. As the 1850s drew to a close, Ralston had established himself as more than just another banker. He was becoming a force that would help shape the future of the American West. The muddy streets were giving way to proper roads, the canvas tents to grand hotels, and the chaotic rush for gold to a more organized system of commerce. But this was just the beginning of his story, and the greatest challenges and opportunities still lay ahead. The Gold Rush Gateway wasn't just about gold, it was about transformation. And in those early years, William Ralston was learning the lessons that would allow him to become one of the most powerful men in the West, a journey that would reshape not just his own fortune, but the very nature of the American frontier. In the shadow of the Sierra Nevada, where hope glittered as brightly as the gold in mountain streams, William Ralston was about to change the face of the American West forever. The year was 1864, and while the nation was torn apart by civil war, San Francisco was witnessing the birth of something extraordinary: the Bank of California. But this wasn't just another bank. This was the beginning of an empire that would reshape the frontier. The bank rose from the dusty streets of San Francisco like a testament to ambition itself. While other banks operated from wooden shacks, Ralston built his financial fortress from solid stone, its marble columns and iron doors a statement to all who passed. The Wild West was growing up. Inside, the floors were polished to a mirror shine, the counters made of imported mahogany, and the vaults, oh, those vaults, were the strongest west of the Mississippi. But Ralston wasn't interested in just storing wealth. He was interested in creating it. When word came of a massive silver strike in Nevada's Comstock Lode, other bankers hesitated. Not Ralston. He saw beyond the raw ore to envision something greater, an entire network of mines, mills, and transportation that would pull wealth from the earth with industrial efficiency. Where others saw risk, he saw the future. The Comstock Lode became Ralston's masterpiece of financial engineering. His bank didn't just provide loans, it built an entire infrastructure. Miles of tunnels were dug beneath the Nevada desert, elaborate pumping systems installed to fight the endless groundwater, and a small army of miners set to work extracting silver ore worth millions. The Bank of California's tentacles reached into every aspect of the operation, from the mining itself to the transportation and processing of ore. In San Francisco, Ralston's influence grew with every passing day. The Bank of California became known as the Gibraltar of the West, its financial power extending far beyond its stone walls. Merchants, miners, and industrialists all knew that a word from Ralston could make or break their dreams. His signature on a loan document was worth more than gold itself. It was a stamp of approval from the man who was quickly becoming known as the King of California. But banking, for Ralston, was never just about money. It was about building something greater. When he looked at the rough and tumble streets of San Francisco, he saw a future metropolis to rival New York or London. His bank funded the construction of theaters, hotels, and restaurants. It backed railroads that would stitch the West together with iron rails. It financed steamship lines that connected California to the world. Every dollar loaned was another brick in the foundation of Ralston's grand vision. The bank's reach extended into every corner of Western commerce. If you were a merchant bringing goods from China, Ralston's bank could finance your voyage. If you were a farmer looking to expand your operations, Ralston's bank could provide the capital. If you were a miner with a promising claim but no equipment, Ralston's bank could make your dreams possible. For a price, of course. Inside the bank's boardroom, Ralston orchestrated his empire with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. His network of informants kept him aware of every significant development in the West. He knew about new mineral strikes before the news hit the streets, about railroad plans before they were made public, about business opportunities before his competitors could act. Information was power, and Ralston had built the most sophisticated intelligence network in the West. The scale of his operations was staggering. By the late 1860s, the Bank of California was handling more than $100 million in gold and silver annually, a sum that would be worth billions today. Its name carried such weight that its banknotes were accepted as far away as London and Hong Kong. When the bank spoke, the entire Western economy listened. Yet, with all this power came risk. Ralston's aggressive expansion strategies meant the bank was often operating on the edge. He believed in the future of the West with such conviction that he was willing to bet everything on it. Loans were made on handshakes, deals were struck based on trust, and millions were invested on little more than Ralston's intuition about a person's character or a project's potential. The bank's involvement in the Comstock Lode grew deeper and more complex. As the mines went deeper, the technical challenges multiplied. Massive steam engines were installed to pump out groundwater and hoist ore from thousands of feet below the surface. New processing methods were developed to handle the complex silver ores. Each challenge required more capital, and each solution pushed the boundaries of what was possible in 19th century engineering. Through it all, Ralston maintained an almost supernatural confidence. When other banks tightened their lending during economic downturns, the Bank of California often expanded its operations. When others saw risk, Ralston saw opportunity. His optimism was infectious, and his success seemed to justify his boldest gambles. The Bank of California became more than just a financial institution. It was the engine driving the development of the American West. Its influence could be seen in every new building rising in San Francisco, every mine shaft sunk in Nevada, every railroad tie laid across the desert. Ralston had created something unprecedented, a financial power that could match the raw energy and ambition of the frontier itself. But even as his empire reached its zenith, storm clouds were gathering. The very scale of Ralston's operations made them vulnerable to shifts in the economic winds. The intricate web of loans, investments, and promises that held everything together required constant attention and adjustment. One wrong move, one miscalculation, could bring it all crashing down. Yet, in those glory days of the late 1860s, such concerns seemed distant. William Ralston had built his money empire, and from his office high above San Francisco's streets, he could look out over the city he had helped create and dream of even greater things to come. The Wild West had found its banker, and the future seemed as bright as the gold in his vaults. In a city built on gold dust and dreams, William Ralston didn't just want to rule a kingdom, he wanted to create one. While others saw San Francisco as a rough-hewn boomtown, Ralston envisioned it as the Paris of the West, a gleaming metropolis that would rival the great cities of Europe. His masterpiece, the Palace Hotel, rose from the streets like a vision from another world, its 7 stories of architectural splendor declaring that the frontier had finally come of age. The palace wasn't just a hotel, it was Ralston's message to the world. In an era when most Western buildings were still made of wood, the palace stood in defiant grandeur, built of stone and iron. Its walls were thick enough to withstand earthquakes, its rooms appointed with luxuries that would make European nobility envious. Every door handle, every chandelier, every piece of silverware was chosen to announce that the American West had arrived on the world stage. But Ralston's vision extended far beyond a single building. He saw San Francisco as the hub of a vast commercial empire stretching from the Pacific coast to China. His steamship lines plowed the waters between continents, carrying goods, gold, and ambitious souls. The California Steam Navigation Company, under his influence, dominated river traffic throughout the state. Where others saw empty coastline, Ralston saw future ports. Where others saw impassable mountains, he envisioned railroad tracks. The king of California's influence touched every aspect of Western development. His bank funded the mining operations that pulled silver from Nevada's depths, the railroads that connected isolated communities, and the businesses that transformed San Francisco from a rough port town into a sophisticated city. He backed theaters and opera houses, believing that culture was as important as commerce in building a great civilization. In the heart of San Francisco, Ralston's morning routine became legendary. Each day, he would ride his horse through the streets, inspecting his growing empire. Construction workers, merchants, and bankers would watch for his arrival, knowing that a word from Ralston could change their fortunes. He didn't just build a city. He orchestrated its growth like a conductor leading a grand symphony. His Belmont estate, south of San Francisco, became a symbol of his success and vision. Here, Ralston entertained the powerful and influential, hosting lavish parties where the future of the West was discussed over fine wines and gourmet meals. The estate's Italian-style villa, with its marble halls and manicured gardens, showed what was possible when Western wealth met Eastern refinement. The reach of Ralston's empire extended into every corner of Western commerce. He invested in quicksilver mines whose mercury was essential for processing gold and silver. He backed woolen mills to supply the growing population, flour mills to feed them, and lumber operations to house them. Every investment was another thread in the elaborate tapestry of his vision. Transportation was key to Ralston's kingdom. He understood that the West's vast distances had to be conquered for his dreams to become reality. His investments in railroads helped stitch the region together, while his steamships connected San Francisco to the world. Under his influence, travel times that had once been measured in months were reduced to weeks or days. But perhaps most remarkable was Ralston's ability to see potential where others saw only obstacles. When engineers said a project was impossible, he found ways to make it happen. When conventional wisdom said a business wouldn't work, he proved the doubters wrong. His confidence was infectious, inspiring others to dream bigger and reach further. The California Theater, another of his grand projects, brought culture and entertainment to the frontier. While other Western cities might have a saloon with a small stage, San Francisco now had a venue that could host world-class performances. It was all part of Ralston's plan to transform the West from a rough frontier into a sophisticated civilization. Yet, with each new project, each new investment, the stakes grew higher. Ralston's kingdom was built on a complex web of loans, investments, and promises. His vision required constant expansion, constant movement forward. Like a shark that must keep swimming to survive, Ralston's empire needed continuous growth to sustain itself. In his prime, Ralston seemed to hold the future of the American West in his hands. From his office in the Bank of California, he could look out over the city he had helped create and see his vision taking shape in steel, stone, and enterprise. The muddy streets had been replaced by proper boulevards, the wooden shacks by impressive buildings, the chaos of the gold rush by the order of commerce. But even as his kingdom reached its greatest extent, there were signs of trouble on the horizon. The very scale of his ambitions made his empire vulnerable. Each new project required more capital. Each new investment carried greater risk. Yet Ralston pressed on, convinced that his vision of a transformed West was too important to fail. His kingdom stood as a testament to what one man's vision could achieve in the wide-open spaces of the American frontier. For a brief, shining moment, William Ralston had turned San Francisco into his own personal canvas, painting upon it his dreams of what the West could become. The cards were stacked higher than ever on Ralston's table, but this time he wasn't playing poker in a San Francisco saloon. He was gambling with an empire. By 1875, the King of California's throne was built on a foundation that grew shakier with each passing day. Like a masterful juggler adding more flaming torches to his act, Ralston kept his countless ventures spinning in the air through an intricate dance of loans, promises, and pure nerve. The Comstock Lode, once a seemingly endless river of silver, was showing signs of running dry. The deeper the mines went, the more expensive they became to operate. Those massive steam engines that pumped out the groundwater and hauled up ore consumed money as voraciously as they consumed coal. Each day, the mines needed to produce more just to keep pace with their operating costs, but the rich veins of silver were becoming harder to find. In San Francisco, Ralston's Palace Hotel had become both his crown jewel and his albatross. Its construction costs had soared far beyond initial estimates, swallowing money like a hungry beast. Each marble column, each crystal chandelier, each piece of custom furniture represented another debt that needed to be paid. Yet Ralston couldn't stop. The palace had become a symbol of his vision for the West, and to leave it unfinished would be to admit defeat. The Bank of California, once considered as solid as the Sierra Nevada mountains themselves, was starting to show cracks in its foundation. Ralston had made loans based on optimistic projections and personal trust rather than hard collateral. He'd backed ventures that other bankers wouldn't touch, believing in the boundless potential of the West. But now, as some of those ventures faltered, the web of financial obligations began to tangle. His private ventures, kept separate from the bank's official business, grew more complex and precarious. Ralston had created a sophisticated shell game, moving money between different enterprises to keep them all afloat. When one venture struggled, he would divert resources from another to cover the shortfall. It was financial alchemy of the highest order, turning paper promises into gold, until the paper started to wear thin. The pressure began to show in subtle ways. Ralston, once known for his leisurely morning rides through San Francisco, now spent more time in his office, poring over ledgers and dispatching urgent telegrams. His famous parties at the Belmont estate became less frequent, and when they did occur, keen observers noted a tension in their host's smile that hadn't been there before. The market panic of 1875 struck like a rattlesnake, fast and deadly. Confidence in silver mines was shaking, and investors were becoming nervous about Western investments. Each new rumor sent tremors through the financial community, and Ralston found himself fighting battles on multiple fronts. He needed to maintain confidence in the Bank of California while also keeping his private ventures from collapsing. His old tricks of financial manipulation became more desperate. Where once he had moved thousands of dollars between accounts to maintain liquidity, now he was moving millions. The margins for error grew thinner, the consequences of a single miscalculation more severe. Each morning brought new challenges, new fires to be extinguished, new holes to be plugged in the dam that held back financial disaster. The strain began to tell on the man himself. The once unshakable confidence that had inspired others to invest millions on his word alone showed signs of cracking. In private moments, away from the public eye, Ralston must have known that he was running out of options. His kingdom had grown too large, too complex, too dependent on continuous growth and optimism to survive a serious downturn. Yet, even as the pressure mounted, Ralston maintained his public face of absolute confidence. He continued to make bold plans, to speak of future developments, to act as though his financial empire was as solid as ever. It was a performance worthy of the stages he had built in his theaters. But, like all performances, it couldn't last forever. The whispers started in financial circles first. Questions about the Bank of California's exposure to mining investments, about the true state of Ralston's private ventures, about the mountain costs of his grand projects. In the rough and tumble world of Western finance, reputation was everything, and once doubt crept in, it spread like wildfire through dry grass. Ralston fought back with every tool at his disposal. He called in favors, made new promises, shifted assets, and sought fresh investments. His financial acrobatics became more daring, more complex, more desperate. Each day became a high-stakes battle to maintain the appearance of stability while scrambling to shore up the reality behind the facade. The pressure was immense. The man who had once seemed to hold the future of the American West in his hands now found himself trapped by the very empire he had built. The qualities that had made him great, his optimism, his willingness to take risks, his absolute belief in the future of the West, were now threatening to bring about his downfall. As the summer of 1875 wore on, the situation became increasingly unstable. The king of California's realm was balanced on a knife's edge, and even the slightest push could send it tumbling into chaos. The only question was whether Ralston could find a way to save his empire before time ran out. The San Francisco Bay churned with a cold, unforgiving darkness on the morning of August 27, 1875. William Ralston's body would be discovered floating near North Beach, the water closing over the man who had once seemed larger than life itself. But this was no simple drowning. It was the final act of a tragedy that had been building for months, perhaps years. Just hours before, the Bank of California had suspended operations. The news spread through San Francisco like wildfire, burning through the financial district and consuming the reputation Ralston had spent decades building. Decades of ambition, of dreams, of transforming the Wild West, all seemed to collapse in a single devastating moment. The morning had started like any other, with Ralston rising early, his mind racing with plans to save his crumbling empire. He walked to the bank, knowing that this might be the day everything would either be saved or destroyed. The weight of millions of dollars, the futures of countless investors, the dreams of an entire region, all balanced precariously on his shoulders. Some said he went swimming that day to clear his head, to escape the mounting pressure. Others whispered darker theories. The bay had always been Ralston's companion, the waterway that had brought him his first fortune, that had connected his steamships to the world. Now it would become his final resting place. The circumstances of his death were as mysterious as they were tragic. A man who had controlled millions, who had been called the King of California, was found floating like just another piece of driftwood. No dramatic gunfight, no spectacular fall from a building, just the cold embrace of the bay that had been central to his life's work. His financial empire had been a delicate machine, held together by confidence, connections, and constant motion. When the Bank of California suspended operations, it was as if someone had pulled the central gear from a complex clockwork. Everything simply stopped. The bank's failure wasn't just a financial disaster. It was the death of a vision, the collapse of a dream of what the West could become. Those who knew Ralston understood that he wasn't just a banker, he was a visionary. He had seen San Francisco not as it was, but as it could be. The Palace Hotel, the steamship lines, the mining operations, these weren't just investments. They were chapters in a grand story of Western transformation. And now, that story seemed to be ending in failure. The irony was brutal. Ralston had taken more risks than any other banker of his time, had pushed further, dreamed bigger. He had transformed San Francisco from a muddy frontier town to a sophisticated city. His investments had built railroads, funded mines, created entire industries. And yet, in a single moment, it all seemed to crumble. Rumors began to circulate immediately. Some said he had been murdered, that his enemies in the banking world had orchestrated his downfall. Others claimed he'd committed suicide, unable to face the financial ruin that was consuming his empire. The truth, as always, was far more complex. His body told no tales. The coroner's report was frustratingly inconclusive. Drowning, they said, but was it accidental? Intentional? The Bay kept its secrets as carefully as Ralston had once kept his financial records. A man who had been so transparent in his ambitions became opaque in his final moments. The funeral was a testament to Ralston's complicated legacy. Thousands attended, including many who had lost fortunes in the bank's collapse. They came not just to bury a man, but to witness the end of an era. The Wild West was changing, and Ralston's death seemed to symbolize that transformation. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Ralston's financial maneuverings became clear. He had been playing a high-stakes game of financial chess, moving assets, creating complex networks of loans and investments. Some called it genius, others called it fraud. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. The Bank of California survived his death, though diminished. The assets were tallied, the losses calculated. Some investors recovered portions of their money, others were left with nothing but memories of a grand vision. Ralston's personal fortune, once estimated in the millions, was reduced to a fraction of its previous value. San Francisco itself seemed to pause, to reflect. The city Ralston had helped build continued to grow, but something had changed. The unbridled optimism, the sense that anything was possible, it had been tempered by reality. The dream of the West was still alive, but it had become more measured, more cautious. In the years that followed, Ralston became something of a legend. Stories were told of his ambition, his vision, his spectacular rise and fall. He was remembered not just as a banker, but as a symbol of the American West, a place where dreams were born, where fortunes could be made and lost in the blink of an eye. The bay that claimed his life continued to lap against the shores of San Francisco, indifferent to human ambition. But the city Ralston had helped create stood as his true monument, a testament to what one man's vision could accomplish in the wild, unpredictable landscape of the American frontier. William Ralston had reached for the stars, and for a moment he had touched them. His fall was as spectacular as his rise, a quintessential Western story of ambition, risk, and the razor-thin line between genius and madness.